The city was alive with the hum of traffic, the chatter of people walking along the sidewalks, and the faint smell of coffee and pastries drifting from cafés on every corner. Among them, there was one café that stood out. Not because it was flashy or fancy, but because it was small, neat, and always full of a certain quiet energy. People came here not just for the coffee, but because it had a sense of calm in the middle of the busy streets. The café was run by a group of hard-working staff who had seen all kinds of customers, from students cramming for exams to business people rushing to meetings. But none of them had ever seen someone like her, the billionaire CEO. The CEO's reputation had spread far beyond her office. People in the city whispered her name with a mix of fear and awe. She was known for being brilliant and extremely successful, but also for being harsh and unforgiving. Employees who had worked under her described her as a person who could make a room freeze with just one look. She had a way of noticing mistakes that nobody else would, and when she found them, she made sure the person responsible felt it. Some said she could sense fear the moment someone walked into her office. Others said that she never forgave laziness or carelessness, no matter who you were. No one in the cafe had actually seen her in person until that day. The staff had only heard about her through news articles, rumors, and stories shared by people who had business dealings with her. She was supposed to be visiting a new company nearby, and the cafe had been informed she might stop by. The employees prepared themselves, making sure the place was spotless. Tables were wiped down, the floor was cleaned, and the coffee machines were polished until they shone. Everyone moved with careful precision, almost as if the air itself had become heavier in anticipation of her arrival. The waitress had been working in the cafe for several years. She was quiet, observant, and had a way of noticing small details that others missed. She didn't come from a wealthy background. Her life had been full of ordinary struggles. She knew the value of hard work, of being polite and careful, and of keeping a calm demeanor even when situations seemed tense. She had seen plenty of difficult customers before, but she had never imagined encountering someone whose reputation alone could make people nervous without even speaking a word. When the bell above the cafe door jingled, everyone instinctively froze. Heads turned. There she was. The CEO walked in with a presence that seemed to command the room. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly styled, and her expression calm but serious. Her eyes swept across the cafe, taking in every detail: the arrangement of tables, the cleanliness of the floor, the movement of the staff. It was as if she could see everything and nothing escaped her notice. Even the faintest crumb or misplaced chair might have been enough to catch her attention. The employees whispered to each other, their voices barely audible. "That's her. She's even more intimidating than I imagined. Just stay calm and do your job." Everyone moved carefully around her, offering polite nods, but avoiding direct eye contact. They had all heard stories about how she could make someone feel small and nervous, simply with a look or a single comment. Some employees had even prepared their excuses for any potential mistakes they might make, afraid that a small error could lead to harsh words. The waitress, however, had a different approach. She had learned over the years that some people, no matter how powerful, responded better to kindness and calm confidence rather than fear. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and prepared herself to take the CEO's order. When the CEO reached the counter, her gaze was steady and sharp. Most people would have felt frozen, but the waitress met her eyes with a polite smile. It wasn't forced or nervous. It was simple and genuine. "Good morning," the waitress said softly. "What can I get for you today?" The CEO paused for a moment, slightly surprised by the warm and composed tone. She wasn't used to people speaking to her without trembling or over-explaining. "I'll have a black coffee. Make it strong," she said, her voice even but commanding. The waitress nodded. "Of course. Would you like anything to eat with that?" The CEO considered for a moment. She was used to people jumping at her commands, offering suggestions she hadn't asked for, or rushing to prepare her order in a way that tried to impress her. But the waitress was different. She simply asked, politely, leaving the choice to the CEO without showing fear or flattery. "Just the coffee," she said. As the waitress prepared the drink, she noticed something unusual. The CEO's hands were steady, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders, a hint of fatigue in her posture. Beneath the powerful exterior, she seemed human, and even a little vulnerable. The waitress smiled to herself quietly. She realized that this wasn't a person who needed to be feared. She was someone who, like everyone else, just expected respect. The coffee was served carefully, with a small smile and a nod. The CEO took it without a word, her expression neutral, as if judging the quality before taking a sip. She looked around the cafe, noticing the other customers and staff. There was a faint moment where her usual commanding presence softened, just slightly, as if she was intrigued by the calm and composed demeanor of the waitress. Other staff members watched nervously, wondering how the CEO would react. They expected criticism, a harsh word, or at least a sign of displeasure. But nothing came. Instead, the CEO took her first sip of coffee, and then another, slowly. She seemed to relax just a little. The waitress continued her work, attending to other customers, but she couldn't help glancing at the CEO every now and then. She noticed subtle changes in her expression. A brief look of curiosity, a slight lift of an eyebrow, and then a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The moment stretched, quiet but charged with tension. The CEO's presence was still strong, but it no longer felt threatening. It was as if the atmosphere in the cafe had shifted, just slightly, because the waitress had met her not with fear, but with calm confidence. The other employees began to feel it too, sensing that the usual intimidation they expected from her might not happen today. As the CEO finished her coffee, she set the cup down carefully, still observing the cafe. The waitress approached to ask if she needed anything else, her tone still warm and respectful. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked. The CEO looked at her for a moment, and then, in a voice slightly softer than before, said, "No, thank you. That will be all." She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and composed. The bell jingled as she left, and a quiet hum of conversation returned to the cafe. The employees exhaled, some shaking slightly from relief. The waitress went back to her work, but she knew that something had changed. She had seen it in the CEO's eyes, a spark of curiosity, a hint of respect. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. For the first time, someone who had been feared by so many had been faced with calm confidence rather than fear, and it had made a difference. Later, when the cafe was quiet again, the waitress reflected on what had happened. She realized that power and authority could be intimidating, but true confidence came from being genuine, polite, and unafraid to be human. She didn't need to impress the CEO or fear her wrath. She only needed to do her job with honesty and kindness, and that, she thought, was enough to make even the most powerful person pause and notice. The story of that day would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't about the coffee, the orders, or the cleanliness of the cafe. It was about something much deeper, the realization that even fearsome people could be met with dignity and calm, and that sometimes the simplest gestures could change how someone sees the world around them. And so, the city carried on, the cafe continued to serve its customers, and the waitress returned to her daily life. But for her, and perhaps for the CEO as well, something subtle had shifted. A new story had begun, one that showed that respect and authenticity could quietly challenge fear, and that even those who seemed untouchable were, at their core, human like everyone else. The next day, the cafe felt a little different. The memory of the billionaire CEO's visit lingered in the minds of the staff. They moved through their tasks carefully, but there was an unusual air of curiosity mingled with relief. No one had expected that someone so powerful could seem, even for a moment, approachable. Yet the waitress, who had interacted with her the day before, carried a quiet confidence that set her apart from the rest. She had learned something valuable, that meeting someone with honesty and calm could make an impact, even on the most intimidating person. The morning was busy as usual. The cafe was filled with the usual crowd. Office workers sipping coffee before heading to their jobs, students hunched over notebooks, and couples chatting quietly over breakfast. The waitress moved between tables, taking orders and serving customers with her gentle smile. She noticed small details, a customer's messy notebook, a spilled drop of coffee, a tired expression on a delivery worker's face. These were the moments she paid attention to, making the ordinary feel cared for. Then, just as the cafe started to settle into a rhythm, the door opened, and a gust of cold air swept inside. The CEO stepped in again. The presence of someone so commanding could have sent the other employees into a panic. But this time it was different. The waitress met her eyes immediately and smiled, unshaken. She didn't rush or fumble. She simply approached with the same calm, polite demeanor she had shown the day before. The CEO looked around the cafe, observing the familiar environment, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel less tense. Perhaps she was testing the staff, or perhaps she had returned because she had been curious about the waitress. Whatever the reason, there was a small hint of a smile on her face, almost invisible but enough for the waitress to notice. "Good morning," the waitress said softly. "How are you today?" The CEO raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the friendly greeting. Most people she encountered treated her with a mixture of fear and excessive politeness, as if they were unsure whether she would approve of them being there at all. The waitress, however, treated her like a regular person, respectful but not afraid. "I'm well," the CEO replied, her tone even, but with a hint of curiosity. "Coffee, the usual." "Of course," the waitress said, preparing the drink. She noticed a small detail. The CEO had a faint crease on her forehead and her shoulders seemed tense. These were small signs that even someone so powerful carried the weight of her responsibilities. The waitress smiled inwardly. She understood that people, no matter how successful, had their moments of pressure and stress, and that sometimes a little kindness could go a long way. As the waitress served the coffee, the CEO observed her carefully. She had expected the same routine she had seen in countless other places: nervous staff, flustered employees, and overeager attempts to impress her. But here, the waitress moved with quiet confidence. She spoke politely, made no mistakes, and carried herself with a sense of ease that was unfamiliar to the CEO. "Thank you," the CEO said, taking the coffee and pausing to sip. The taste was perfect, and she made a subtle nod, acknowledging the skill with which it had been prepared. "Do you work here long?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. "Yes," the waitress replied simply. "I've been here for several years. I enjoy working here. It's peaceful, and I like meeting new people." The CEO seemed to consider this. She rarely asked questions like this, and she was unaccustomed to receiving honest, simple answers without flattery. Most people she spoke to tried to impress her or show off their knowledge, but the waitress simply spoke the truth. That honesty intrigued her. As the cafe began to fill with the morning rush, the CEO moved to a table by the window. She pulled out her phone and started checking emails, but she couldn't help glancing up at the waitress occasionally. There was something different about her, something that made the CEO pause and reconsider the usual assumptions she made about people. She had spent so much of her life commanding respect through fear and authority that the idea of someone earning respect through simple confidence was almost foreign to her. The waitress continued her work, moving among tables with grace. She noticed a small incident at the next table. A child had dropped a cookie, and the mother was too busy on her phone to notice. The waitress bent down, picked up the cookie, and handed it back with a gentle smile. The mother thanked her, slightly embarrassed. The CEO watched this small act of kindness, and for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. Power and money had always been her shields, but here was someone showing influence in a completely different way, through attention, care, and human connection. The morning passed, and the CEO didn't leave immediately. She stayed longer than she needed, observing the flow of the cafe and the way the waitress handled each customer. She noticed how the staff responded differently to the waitress compared to themselves. There was a subtle respect that came naturally, not forced by fear. She found herself wondering how someone so ordinary could command such influence simply by being kind and composed. Then came the moment that would define the day. A small mistake occurred. A customer's drink was poured incorrectly, and it could have led to a tense situation. Most staff would have panicked, fearing criticism or embarrassment. But the waitress stepped in smoothly. She corrected the order with a calm smile, apologized gently, and even made a small, light-hearted comment to ease the customer's frustration. The atmosphere softened immediately. The CEO watched in fascination. She realized that this was something she had never experienced in her career. People had always obeyed her commands, tried to impress her, or feared her judgment. They had never earned her respect through simple human decency. The waitress, without realizing it, had shown her a completely different kind of influence. One that didn't rely on intimidation or power, but on genuine care and confidence. By the time the morning rush ended, the CEO was no longer the untouchable figure that everyone feared. She was still powerful, still brilliant, but she had seen a glimpse of a different way to be. She left the cafe quietly, but not without a small nod toward the waitress. It was a subtle acknowledgement, almost invisible to anyone else, but it carried weight. The waitress noticed it, and she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't sought recognition or praise. She had simply been herself, and that was enough. Later, as the cafe returned to its usual calm, the staff spoke in hushed tones about the CEO's visit. They were still in awe, but there was a new feeling, one of possibility. They saw how someone could remain true to themselves even in the presence of great power, and how small acts of kindness and confidence could make a lasting impression. The waitress cleaned the counter and reflected on the morning. She thought about how easily fear could dominate people's behavior, and how rare it was to see someone confront it with simple calmness and authenticity. She realized that the CEO's presence, intimidating as it was, hadn't frightened her because she didn't rely on fear or pretense. She had met the situation honestly, and it had changed the dynamic entirely. Even after the CEO left, her influence lingered in the cafe, not as a force of fear, but as a point of reflection. The staff began to understand that power wasn't only about authority or wealth. True influence could be subtle, earned through respect, human connection, and the courage to be genuine. The waitress had shown them that, and in doing so, she had quietly reshaped the way they saw the world around them. By the end of the day, the cafe felt warmer, more alive, as if the simple act of being authentic had left a mark not only on the CEO but on everyone who had witnessed it. The waitress went home that evening tired but content, knowing that her ordinary actions had made an extraordinary impression. And for the CEO, the experience had planted a seed of curiosity, a small question about how she had treated people all her life, and whether there might be a better way to connect and lead. The encounter had been brief, seemingly ordinary, but it carried a lesson that neither of them would forget. For the waitress, it was a reminder of the power of humility and calm. For the CEO, it was a quiet revelation that even the most fearsome figure could learn something from someone who simply chose to be kind and unafraid. The world of business, authority, and power seemed a little less rigid that day, and in that small cafe, a new story had begun to unfold. One that would change both of their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. The following morning, the cafe buzzed with its usual rhythm, but there was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air. The memory of the CEO's visits the previous days lingered like an invisible presence. Staff whispered quietly among themselves, sharing their impressions and speculating about whether she might come again. Some were nervous, still intimidated by her reputation, while others felt a flicker of hope, inspired by how the waitress had interacted with her calmly and confidently. The waitress arrived early, as she always did, preparing the cafe for the day. She arranged tables, wiped counters, and made sure everything was in its place. Even though she had already seen the CEO twice, she didn't know what to expect. She reminded herself to stay calm and polite, knowing that the simplest approach was often the most powerful. There was no need to impress or overthink, just genuine, steady attention to her work. The cafe door jingled, and her heart skipped a little. There she was again. The CEO walked in with the same commanding presence as before. She was dressed in a crisp suit, carrying herself with authority, yet there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there the first day. The waitress smiled politely, her demeanor calm and collected. She didn't rush, didn't falter, and didn't act differently than she would with any other customer. That simple steadiness seemed to intrigue the CEO. "Good morning," the waitress said gently. "Will it be the usual coffee today?" The CEO paused, considering the question. She had been so used to people rushing to serve her that the waitress' calm tone felt almost revolutionary. "Yes, the usual," she replied. Her voice carried less command than before, more curiosity. As the waitress prepared the coffee, she noticed the CEO's hands resting on the counter, slightly clenched. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it suggested tension, a pressure that came from being responsible for everything around her. The waitress didn't judge or react. She simply worked with care, moving through her tasks with the quiet confidence that had begun to catch the CEO's attention. When she brought the coffee over, she placed it gently on the table. "Here you go. I hope it's exactly how you like it," she said with a polite smile. The CEO took the cup, looking at it as though evaluating more than just the drink. She was studying the waitress herself, noticing the calm, unshakable manner in which she carried herself. "It's perfect," she said finally, and there was a faint lift at the corner of her mouth, a subtle smile that few people ever saw. For the next few minutes, the cafe fell into a quiet rhythm. The CEO was engrossed in her work, occasionally glancing at the waitress as she moved gracefully between tables, helping other customers and handling small incidents with ease. A customer had spilled a cup of juice, and the waitress quickly cleaned it up, calming the upset child with a gentle word. Another customer had trouble deciding what to order, and she guided them kindly without rushing or showing irritation. The CEO watched all of this, her curiosity growing. Then came a moment that changed the atmosphere completely. A customer, unaware of who was present, accidentally bumped into the CEO's table, causing her coffee cup to tip slightly. Most staff would have panicked, expecting the CEO's sharp reaction, but the waitress acted immediately. She stepped forward, steady and confident. "I'll get that cleaned up right away," she said softly, grabbing a napkin. She steadied the cup, ensuring it didn't spill further, and placed it back safely on the table. The CEO, expecting a tense moment, was surprised to see the situation handled so smoothly and without fear. She looked at the waitress, her eyes narrowing slightly, but not in anger, more in intrigue. "You handled that well," the CEO said, her tone quiet but with a hint of surprise. "Most people would have panicked." The waitress smiled politely. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Accidents happen." She didn't praise herself, didn't exaggerate, and didn't seek approval. Her calm honesty and simple approach spoke louder than words. The CEO leaned back in her chair slightly, considering this. She had spent so many years relying on fear to maintain control. Employees followed her commands because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. But here was someone who commanded attention without intimidation, without trying to impress, just by being steady, kind, and human. It was a revelation she hadn't expected. As the morning continued, the CEO observed the waitress more closely. She noticed how effortlessly she managed multiple tasks, how she listened to each customer, and how she seemed genuinely present in every moment. There was a subtle strength in her actions, a quiet authority that didn't rely on shouting or demanding respect. The CEO realized that this was a kind of influence she had rarely experienced. One that wasn't forced, one that came naturally from being authentic. Then, something small but significant happened. A customer at another table began complaining loudly about a mistake in their order. Most staff would have either panicked or argued back, but the waitress approached calmly. She apologized politely, offered a solution, and even added a light-hearted comment that made the customer laugh and relax. The entire cafe seemed to exhale collectively as tension dissolved. The CEO watched, fascinated. She realized something important in that moment. Power, money, and authority were not the only ways to influence people. Respect could be earned through patience, humility, and attentiveness. People responded not to fear, but to genuine care and confidence. The waitress had demonstrated a kind of leadership the CEO had rarely seen. And the more she watched, the more she understood that this simple, human approach could be far more effective than intimidation. By late morning, the cafe had quieted again. The CEO stood up to leave, but this time she didn't rush out or leave silently. She approached the waitress directly, her steps measured but deliberate. The staff held their breath, unsure of what to expect. The The CEO looked down at the waitress, her expression unreadable. "You have a way of handling things that I've never seen before," she said quietly. "Most people would be afraid, but you stay calm and confident. It's unusual." The waitress blinked, slightly taken aback by the compliment. She wasn't used to receiving praise from someone so powerful. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just try to do my job well and treat people with respect. That's all." The CEO studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's more than that. It's a skill, a presence. You make people feel safe even when they might be nervous. That's rare." The waitress smiled politely, feeling a quiet warmth. She didn't need to say more. Her simple approach had made an impact, and the CEO had noticed. There was no arrogance, no need to boast. Just acknowledgement that her calmness had made a difference. As the CEO left the cafe, the staff exchanged glances, realizing that something remarkable had happened. The waitress had shown that even someone who seemed untouchable, someone who inspired fear in countless people, could be impressed and influenced simply by being genuine. The lesson was clear. Respect and confidence didn't have to come from wealth or power. They could come from quiet strength and authenticity. The waitress returned to her work, moving among tables with the same gentle efficiency. She didn't dwell on the encounter, but she felt a subtle shift in the cafe. The atmosphere was lighter, more relaxed, and the staff seemed inspired by the way she had handled herself. Even small interactions took on new meaning. They could be opportunities to influence and connect, just like she had demonstrated. By the end of the day, the memory of the CEO's visit had settled into something more than just curiosity. It was a turning point. For the CEO, it had planted a seed of reflection about how she treated people, how she had used fear in her career, and whether there might be a better way to inspire respect. For the waitress, it was a quiet affirmation that staying true to oneself, even in the presence of power, could make a lasting impact. That evening, the waitress cleaned up the cafe, reflecting on the lessons of the day. She thought about the small moments that mattered, the gentle handling of spilled drinks, the patient guidance of customers, and the calm approach to unexpected situations. She realized that influence wasn't about being loud or demanding. It was about being present, attentive, and genuine. And somewhere in her office, the CEO replayed the events in her mind. She thought about the waitress and the way she had handled herself with quiet confidence. She began to question her usual methods, wondering if there was more to leadership than authority and fear. The encounter had been brief, but it had planted a thought that would grow, slowly but surely, over time. The cafe returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of the morning lingered. The staff carried on their work with renewed awareness, inspired by the quiet power of authenticity. And the waitress, as always, remained steady, attentive, and kind, unaware of just how much her calm confidence had already begun to change someone else's perspective. It was a simple lesson, yet profound. Sometimes, the bravest act isn't loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's simply being yourself, treating others with respect, and remaining steady in the face of fear. And in that quiet, unassuming way, the waitress had already begun to make a difference far beyond what she could see. The following morning, the city streets were busier than usual. The cafes, offices, and sidewalks all pulsed with the rhythm of life. But one small cafe had a quiet anticipation that day. Word had spread among the staff about the CEO's previous visits. Though she hadn't announced she was coming again, everyone felt a subtle tension, a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Yet the waitress moved calmly, methodically, and gently through the space, as she always did. She didn't need to prepare for someone powerful. She only focused on her work, keeping a steady heart and attentive eyes. The bell above the door jingled mid-morning, and the CEO stepped inside once again. She carried herself with the same unmistakable presence. But this time there was something different in her expression. It was less sharp, less intimidating. There was a subtle softness, a curiosity that hadn't been there during her first visit. She walked toward the counter, glancing around the cafe, but her gaze settled on the waitress. The waitress returned her look with a calm smile, moving with natural ease as she greeted her. "Good morning," the waitress said gently. Will it be the usual today? The CEO hesitated briefly. Normally, she expected people to speak nervously or overcompensate to gain her approval. Instead, the waitress simply asked, as if she were asking any customer, leaving the choice up to her. Yes, the CEO finally said, her voice quiet, tinged with a curiosity she couldn't hide. The waitress began preparing the coffee, noticing small details she had observed before. The slight tension in the CEO's shoulders, the subtle crease in her forehead, the faint weight in her steps. These were the small things that revealed a person's humanity, even in someone so powerful. She moved with the same calm precision as always, arranging the cup carefully and handling everything with gentle attention. When she placed the coffee on the table, the CEO took it and nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said softly. She sipped the coffee slowly, as if savoring not just the taste but the experience. There was a quiet moment where she simply observed the café, the customers, and the staff. Most people would have seen her as untouchable, but the waitress treated her as human, and that simple act seemed to disarm her in a way she hadn't expected. The morning carried on with its usual rhythm, but the CEO stayed longer than usual. She watched the waitress as she moved between tables, noticing how she listened carefully to each customer, how she handled small problems without fuss, and how she made people feel at ease. The CEO's mind began to wander, thinking about how rare it was to encounter someone who commanded respect without relying on power or fear. She reflected on her own life, the countless years she had spent expecting obedience and admiration from people, and how little she had truly understood about influence beyond authority. Then a small incident occurred that caught everyone's attention. A young man accidentally dropped a stack of papers at a nearby table, sending a few sheets fluttering to the floor. Most employees would have rushed over nervously, unsure how the CEO would react. But the waitress acted calmly. She bent down, picked up the papers, and handed them back to the man with a friendly smile. "Here you go. Don't worry about it," she said gently. The man thanked her, relieved by her calm handling of the situation. The CEO watched quietly, fascinated. The waitress had not only solved the problem, but she had done so in a way that made everyone around feel comfortable. There was no tension, no fear, just a subtle sense of order restored through human kindness. The CEO found herself thinking about her own interactions with people. How often had she relied on intimidation, sharp words, or strict rules to maintain control? How often had she inspired fear rather than genuine respect? For the first time, she began to question her approach. The realization was uncomfortable. She had built her empire on intelligence, strategy, and power, yet she had often overlooked the human element, the simple, quiet way people respond to care and understanding. She looked at the waitress and realized that her influence came not from status, but from authenticity. She noticed the way customers instinctively followed the waitress' guidance, the way they relaxed in her presence, and the way even minor incidents were resolved seamlessly because of her calm confidence. The CEO leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the waitress as she moved gracefully between tables. There was a subtle admiration in her gaze, mingled with a strange, new-feeling humility. She had rarely experienced someone showing strength and presence without demanding it or asserting it forcefully. Here was someone ordinary, yet extraordinary in the quiet way she handled herself. Then came a pivotal moment. A customer approached the counter, clearly upset over a mistake with their order. They began speaking sharply, their frustration rising. The staff tensed, fearing the CEO's reaction. But the waitress stepped forward, her voice calm and gentle. "I understand, and I'm so sorry for the mistake," she said. "Let me fix it for you right away." She added a small, light-hearted remark that made the customer laugh and immediately relax. The tension in the cafe dissolved instantly. The CEO watched in awe. The waitress had not only diffused a potentially tense situation but had done so in a way that left everyone feeling better. This was influence without intimidation, leadership without authority, and power without force. The CEO realized that she had spent her entire career teaching fear, expecting obedience, and maintaining control, yet the waitress had demonstrated something far more powerful. By midday, the CEO was no longer just observing. She began reflecting deeply on herself, her choices, and her approach to life and business. She thought about her employees, the way she had treated them, and the fear she had relied on to maintain authority. She realized that perhaps she had underestimated the value of humility, patience, and genuine human connection. The waitress had taught her this lesson quietly, without a single command or critique, simply by being herself. At one point, the CEO stood up and approached the waitress. The staff held their breath, uncertain what would happen. The CEO's expression was thoughtful, almost vulnerable. "You have a way of handling people that I've never seen before," she said quietly. "Most people would be nervous or intimidated, but you stay calm and you make everyone feel at ease. How do you do it?" The waitress smiled politely. "I just try to do my job and treat people with respect. That's all." The CEO studied her for a moment, her eyes softening. "It's more than that," she said. "It's a presence. You make people feel safe, even when they might be nervous or upset. It's rare, and it's remarkable." The waitress bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the compliment without pride or arrogance. She didn't need to impress or explain herself further. Her calm confidence had already made an impact. The CEO returned to her table, her mind spinning with new thoughts. She realized that she had been operating under assumptions for decades, that authority came from fear, and respect was earned through power. Yet here was a woman ordinary by most measures, demonstrating a completely different kind of strength. The CEO began to wonder if she could learn from this, if she could adjust her own behavior to inspire respect through understanding rather than intimidation. As the day continued, the waitress handled each task with the same gentle efficiency. She served customers, resolved small problems, and moved with a quiet grace that seemed effortless. The CEO continued to observe her, thinking deeply about the lesson she was learning. Influence, she realized, was not about asserting power. It was about connecting, understanding, and earning trust naturally. By the time the café slowed in the afternoon, the CEO had been changed in a subtle but profound way. She understood that her reputation for fear and authority had brought compliance, but not true respect. The waitress had shown her a different path, one where calm confidence, authenticity, and empathy could inspire people far more effectively than fear ever could. Before leaving, the CEO approached the waitress once more. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've given me something to think about, more than I realized I needed." The waitress smiled, understanding that words were unnecessary. Her simple actions had already spoken volumes. The CEO nodded, gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, and left the cafe. After she left, the staff gathered, whispering about the morning's events. They were amazed at what they had witnessed, inspired by the quiet strength of the waitress and the subtle transformation in someone they had once feared. The lesson was clear. True influence doesn't come from intimidation, wealth, or authority. It comes from authenticity, calm confidence, and treating people with respect. That evening, the waitress cleaned up the cafe, reflecting on the day. She thought about how easily fear could control people, and how rare it was to meet someone who could challenge it simply by being genuine. She understood that her simple acts had shown the CEO something important, that strength isn't only measured by power, but by presence, kindness, and humility. And somewhere in her office, the CEO replayed the events of the day. She thought about the waitress, her calm demeanor, and her quiet strength. She realized that this ordinary woman had taught her an extraordinary lesson. For the first time in a long while, she questioned her usual methods, wondering if there might be a better way to inspire respect and connect with people. The cafe returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of the day lingered. The staff felt lighter, inspired by the quiet demonstration of influence and human connection. And the waitress, as always, moved through her tasks with gentle confidence, unaware of how profoundly she had already affected someone's life, including the life of one of the most powerful people in the city. It was a simple, quiet lesson, yet it carried enormous weight. The bravest act wasn't in raising one's voice or asserting power. It was in being oneself, treating others with respect, and remaining calm in the face of fear. And in doing so, the waitress had already begun to change the way the CEO saw the world, and perhaps the way she would lead from that day forward. The morning sun poured gently through the windows of the café, creating a warm, golden glow across the tables. The city outside was alive with the usual bustle, but inside the café, there was a calm rhythm that the staff had come to rely on. The waitress moved quietly from table to table, her hands steady, her eyes attentive, and her smile gentle. She had grown accustomed to the routine, yet she felt an unspoken sense that today might be different. She had seen the CEO several times now, and each visit had been a quiet lesson in patience, observation, and understanding. What had begun as curiosity from the CEO's side had slowly transformed into something more profound. The CEO had started noticing the power of small, deliberate acts of kindness and confidence. And though she had not said much openly, her presence carried a subtle change, a softness, an attentiveness that had not existed before. The bell above the door jingled, and the CEO entered once again. This time, there was no tension in the cafe, only a quiet expectation. The staff exchanged glances, wondering what would happen today. The CEO walked with the same composed presence, but her expression was different. She seemed more relaxed, more reflective, and yet more aware. She approached the counter, her eyes meeting the waitress's. "Good morning," the waitress said softly, her voice warm but calm. "Will it be the usual today?" The CEO paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," she replied, but there was something in her tone, less command, more acknowledgement. It carried a weight of thoughtfulness, as if she had spent her nights reflecting on the lessons she had observed in the cafe over the past days. The waitress prepared the coffee as usual, her movements fluid and natural. She noticed small details as she always did, the slight relaxation in the CEO's shoulders, the way she carried herself with less tension, the faint glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. These were subtle, yet they spoke volumes. The CEO was learning, but perhaps she didn't fully realize the extent of her own transformation yet. As the waitress served the coffee, she added a gentle word. "I hope you enjoy it today. We've made it with care." The CEO took the cup and nodded, a faint smile appearing. "Thank you," she said softly. She moved to a table by the window, still observing the cafe, still taking in the ordinary yet extraordinary details of the world around her. She watched the waitress assist other customers, noticing how effortlessly she diffused minor issues, made everyone feel comfortable, and commanded attention without raising her voice or demanding respect. The CEO began reflecting deeply. For years, she had relied on authority, wealth, and power to maintain her position. People had always obeyed her because they feared her, but she now realized that fear was not the same as respect. It was clear that respect earned through intimidation was shallow, fragile, and temporary. True influence, she saw now, came from authenticity, calm confidence, and care for others. She watched the waitress and recognized that her quiet strength had achieved something she had never achieved through force. It had earned genuine respect from everyone around her. Then came a small, yet significant moment. A young boy dropped a small plate, causing a soft crash. The cafe fell silent for a moment, expecting the CEO's reaction. Most people would have been startled or anxious, but the waitress acted immediately. She bent down, picked up the plate, and smiled at the boy. "It's okay," she said. "Accidents happen. Let's make it right." She guided the boy to a new plate, and the mother thanked her quietly. The CEO watched closely. This simple act, executed calmly and confidently, struck her more than any display of power ever could. The waitress had handled a potential moment of embarrassment and tension with kindness and poise. She hadn't forced anyone to respect her. She had inspired it naturally. The CEO thought about her own employees, how often she had overlooked these small moments of human connection in favor of maintaining control. A sense of humility washed over her. By mid-morning, the CEO decided to approach the waitress directly. She walked to her calmly, her footsteps measured, as if each step carried a thought she had been nurturing for days. The staff watched silently, unsure what would happen, but sensing a shift in the air. The The CEO looked at the waitress, her expression softer than before, her voice quieter than usual. "You've shown me something I didn't realize I was missing," she said. "I've spent so long believing that respect and influence come from power. But what you do, it's different. You make people feel seen, heard, and valued. And somehow, that makes them respect you far more than fear ever could." The waitress smiled politely. "I just try to treat people with kindness and do my best," she said softly. "I never thought about it as teaching anyone anything. I just act the way I hope others would act toward me." The CEO considered this, her eyes thoughtful. "It's more than that," she said. "You have a presence, a calm confidence that people naturally respond to. It's rare, and it's powerful." The waitress nodded quietly, understanding that no further explanation was necessary. Her quiet actions had already made a deep impression. She returned to her work, continuing to serve customers with the same gentle efficiency, while the CEO observed from her table, absorbing every movement, every detail, and every interaction. As the day went on, the CEO reflected on her own life and career. She thought about the times she had intimidated employees, demanded obedience, and relied on fear to maintain control. She realized that while it had brought compliance, it had not inspired loyalty, trust, or genuine respect. Watching the waitress, she understood that leadership could be different, that influence could be earned through care, patience, and authenticity. A few more incidents occurred that morning: small spills, confused orders, and minor misunderstandings. Each time, the waitress handled them with quiet grace, diffusing tension with her calm approach. The CEO began to take notes in her mind, silently learning the value of subtlety, empathy, and presence. She realized that these small, ordinary moments were what truly built respect and connection. By afternoon, the café had quieted, and the CEO stood to leave. But this time, she did something different. She walked to the waitress again, her expression sincere and thoughtful. "I want to thank you," she said. "You've given me a new perspective. More than that, you've shown me that strength and influence don't have to come from fear or authority. You've reminded me that people respond to kindness and calm, and that true respect is earned through empathy and understanding." The waitress nodded, feeling a quiet warmth. "I'm glad I could help," she said simply. "I don't think of it as helping anyone. I just try to be kind." The CEO paused for a moment, her eyes softening. "It's more than kindness. You've taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. I will carry this lesson with me. Thank you." She turned, walking toward the door, but before leaving, she looked back one final time and offered a small, genuine smile. It was a rare expression from someone so formidable, and it spoke volumes. The staff watched in awe, realizing that the CEO's behavior had changed in subtle but profound ways. The waitress had done something extraordinary without raising her voice, demanding attention, or asserting authority. She had simply been herself, calm, kind, attentive, and confident. And in doing so, she had taught a lesson that even the most powerful person could not ignore. As the café settled into its quieter afternoon pace, the waitress reflected on the events of the past few days. She understood that influence didn't require wealth, authority, or intimidation. It came from authenticity, calm confidence, and respect for others. She realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught quietly, through ordinary actions carried out with sincerity. The CEO's visits continued over the next few days, each time observing the waitress, reflecting on her own behavior, and slowly adjusting how she approached people in her life and business. The changes were subtle, but they were real. She began to consider her employees differently, noticing small opportunities to connect, listen, and show appreciation. The fear-based authority she had relied on for decades started to give way to something stronger. Genuine respect earned through empathy and understanding. The waitress continued her work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She didn't seek recognition or praise. She simply moved through her day with quiet confidence, helping customers, solving small problems, and being fully present in each moment. Yet the impact of her actions stretched far beyond the walls of the café. She had shown the CEO, and everyone watching, that true power lies in calm, authenticity, and human connection. By the end of the week, the CEO left the cafe one final time, but not without leaving an impression that would last. She had begun to transform, influenced by the quiet strength and kindness of someone she had once underestimated. And the waitress, through her simple actions and steady presence, had taught a powerful lesson. That true respect, trust, and influence are not commanded, they are earned. As the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, the staff reflected on what they had witnessed. They had seen an ordinary woman quietly change the perspective of someone extraordinary. They had learned that courage is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, courage is calm, patient, and genuine. And sometimes, it changes lives in ways no one could have predicted. The waitress finished her shift, stepping outside into the evening air. She felt the satisfaction of a job well done, of ordinary acts carried out with sincerity, and of a quiet lesson taught without words. Somewhere in the city, the CEO was walking back to her office, her mind buzzing with new insights, and her heart quietly softened by the unexpected power of kindness. It was a story that would stay with both of them forever. A story of fear confronted with calm, authority met with quiet confidence, and a life lesson that proved even the most powerful person can be influenced by authenticity, empathy, and the courage to be oneself. And in that simple cafe, in the heart of the bustling city, the waitress continued her work, unaware of the extraordinary impact she had made, yet leaving a mark that would ripple far beyond the walls she served within.